All right, so let's keep talking about these macroinvertebrates that we should find in the stream. We're starting to get into the ones that are somewhat sensitive to pollution. They're not real sensitive where they're going to freak out and possibly disappear, die off, or move to a different location if there's pollution. They can handle a little bit of pollution. So that should start a flag or a little thing to remember. All right, each of these next several macroinvertebrates can handle water that's not as good as the water the first four had to have. So we can have a declining water quality to have these there. Now, the presence of these things doesn't mean the water's bad. Look at it more of an absence. The absence of the sensitive ones means the water's bad. But the presence of these things, again, doesn't indicate you have bad water. All right, so caddisflies. Caddisflies, Trichoptera, the order Trichoptera, just like most of the others, when they metamorphosize into an adult, they become a winged terrestrial insect, flying around. Plenty of land-based animals use them as a food source. So how do we identify them? Well, let's look at the nymph features. A lot of them will be encased in these little gravel houses. So this thing over on the side here, this is a caddisfly house. So they use sticky secretions to grab little pebbles and stick them together and basically make themselves a little tube or cocoon full of gravel or other little pieces of debris that can be found in the substrate. So they protect themselves, and then they stick their heads out, they grab some food, and they pull their heads back in. If you get a caddisfly out of the gravel case, then what we often notice are there are fluffy gills on the abdomen, and then they'll have 6 legs with claws. All right, so again, let me get the pen and kind of highlight these things. All right, so again, here's our case. So if you see this little thing that looks like a little collection of pebbles and it's moving, that might be a caddisfly. If you pick it up, be gentle, give it a little bit of a squeeze, and it feels kind of squishy, it's probably for sure a caddisfly. It's not going to be solid. It's going to be kind of squishy. So imagine gluing a bunch of little rocks to your shirt, and then you push on it, it moves, it's got a little bit of flexibility. But that helps caddisfly kind of lock in and give it weight so it doesn't get washed downstream. Again, taking them out of the case, and we're looking at here the gills, these little fluffy gills sticking up off of the abdomen, much easier to see with the microscope, and then we will have the 6 legs and claws on the legs. Location for these guys, gravel bottoms, usually within the substrate where there's a bunch of little pebbles. Because they live down there, they stick all those onto themselves and then feed in there. Now there's a big diversity again within caddisflies. Some of them are herbivores, some are carnivores, some are omnivores, and they eat whatever they can get a hold of. That's that diversity within the thousands of species of caddisflies that are known to science. Tolerance to pollution, again, they're somewhat sensitive. When we say somewhat, we mean they can handle a little bit of pollution. It doesn't have to be a crystal clear, pure environment for caddisflies. So if your water quality is declining, caddisflies still can survive there. Whereas the helgramiths, the water beetles, some of those other things we talked about, they most likely will disappear. But as I mentioned, and I'll reemphasize this again, the presence of these things does not mean bad water. It's the absence that means the water is bad. So, okay, next group. And this is also a somewhat sensitive group. The next several are. All right, these are the damselflies. Damselflies go in the order Odonta. Winged terrestrial adult form. So they're out there flying around on land and playing a big role in the terrestrial food chain. Now, how do we identify the nymph? Well, 6 legs with 2 claws on each. Sounds a little bit familiar, but the big feature, 3 feathery gills on the tail. And they tend to have a long, slender body. Okay, so the gills on the tail tend to be a really good diagnostic feature when we're looking at damselflies. So back to the pen. All right, so here are the feathery gills. You got 1 there, 2, and number 3. So they actually look like bird feathers, tiny bird feathers, but they do look like little bird feathers stuck on the back end of the damselfly. So you think about back it up, the mayflies that have 3 tails, notice it just looks like a stick coming out. It's not feathery. That's the big diagnostic feature on the damselfly, is that big feathery tail. These tend to always be found under rocks. They are going to be active predators, chomping and chewing and eating stuff up, and tolerance to pollution. Again, they're somewhat sensitive. They can handle a little bit. They don't like a lot, but they can handle some pollution better than the mayflies. So if you have water quality that's so-so, and you got a 3-tailed nymph, check the tail feathers, probably a damselfly. Now, also in Odonta are the dragonflies. Now, when we look at dragonflies, those are winged terrestrial insects as adults flying around. How do we know it's a dragonfly and not a damselfly? Because they're in the same order. So there's going to be similar features that place them in that order, but there's enough differences to be able to distinguish this as a dragonfly nymph versus a damselfly nymph. So 6 legs with 2 claws on each. Body, though, is short and stocky body, and no tail appendages. So when we look at that body plan, they're kind of, I don't want to use the word stumpy, but they tend to be shorter and broader. They're not as thin and, if you want to say graceful, as the damselfly. So, okay, so here's the body. Kind of, again, short and stocky, thicker, almost looks beefier, like more muscular. Not muscular, though. We got the 6 legs, 3 on each side, and notice, here's the tail. There's no appendages sticking out like what we saw in the last slide when we were looking at the damselfly. All right, so same order because they have similar features, some similarity in features, but different, enough difference to separate them once we get down to the family level, definitely genus species. Under rocks as well, and active predators. Pollution tolerance is again somewhat sensitive. Okay, now take a look at this one. Superficially, this almost looks like a helgrameth. And a lot of times it's easy for even experienced researchers to trip up and misclassify them. But these guys are actually fish flies. So Dobson flies are different than fish flies. The adults both become winged terrestrial insects, but to determine the difference, we want to look at the body and actually do some counting. Yep. Okay, so they're similar to helgrameths, but these guys are going to be smaller. Now, it doesn't help you if you have a small helgrameth, but across the species, fish flies are going to be smaller on average. Oh. They lack gills along the abdomen. So that's going to be a big difference. We put them both in a container. We watch them for a while. You'll see the gills of a helgrameth come out. Fish flies, you're not going to see any gills coming out between those little appendages. And if you remember, hellgrammites have 8 appendages. Fish flies have 7. Fish flies also have 2 short, fleshy tails. All right, so superficially, with a quick glance, you go, oh, that's another hellgrammite. Double check. Easiest thing to double check, count those little appendages coming off. So you count these things, and let me get a different color here. You count these little guys, you're going to have 7 appendages coming off instead of the 8 we saw in the hellgrammite. Again, you won't see gills coming out when they're sitting in a container of water. And then if you can get down to the tail here, you're going to have 2 fleshy appendages, little short tails sticking out there. Okay. Edges of slower moving water, they tend to tuck up underneath substrate. Some of them are going to be herbivores, others will be active carnivores, not nearly as aggressive as what we'll see with the hellgrammites. And the pollution tolerance, they're somewhat sensitive to pollution, so they can handle more pollution than a hellgrammite. Hellgrammites will disappear first before these guys will disappear. All right, so we want to be careful we don't misidentify them, because that will definitely impact our rating on the water quality. So if we call these guys hellgrammites, we're going to all of a sudden give the water quality of the river a much higher rating than it should get. The other direction, if we misidentify hellgrammites as fish flies, we're going to give the water quality a lower rating. So we want to be really careful here with these two so we don't mix them up. So again, keep that in mind. Now, okay, let's take a look at true bugs. This is the order Hemiptera. These guys also have a lifestyle where as adults they're fully aquatic. So we're going to see the nymphs are in the water, they metamorphosize and they stay in the water as a big player in the aquatic ecosystem. Now, how do we know what a nymph looks like of a true bug? 6 legs, notice the theme, with 2 claws on each. Oop. They will lack gills. And probably one of the easier features, if we get them, we can get a good look at them. There's often a pointed beak projecting from the head, and they have sucking mouth parts. So look at the head on these guys. That's going to be one of our better diagnostic features. So you find the head. Here's the beak that it's referring to right here. And there's some sucking mouth parts right there. So same way with this guy. Here's the beak, the head, the beak. Now you're looking at the underneath view of this one. And can't see them real well, but right there at the tip of that white line, that is one of the sucking mouth parts, and there's another one right next to it. So they're going to use these mouth parts to pierce their prey and suck juices from them. Now, some of them will pierce plant prey and suck juices and nutrients from plants. Others will do it to animals and suck the juices and the nutrients from the animals. We often find these guys at the edges of slower moving water. So in the Saboon River, depending on where you're at, you find a little curve where the water is slower. Maybe there's some vegetation growing there. That's where you are more likely to come across some of these Hemiptera, some of these true bugs. Odds are we're not going to see these in the center of the river because the water current is too fast. Now, when it comes to pollution tolerance, these guys are actually pretty tolerant. They can deal with pollution. Like, okay, water quality is not so good. It's okay. We still can survive and deal with this type of environment. Okay, in the next lecture, we will wrap up there's only 2 more groups of macroinvertebrates we're going to talk about, and then we'll talk about sampling methods.